Good afternoon. This is the session on the rising case for gentrification, renewal, and conversion in West African CBDs. This is an interesting topic, not talked about so much in the real estate sphere for obvious reasons, because we are oftentimes the guilty parties for gentrifying locations. But today we will be talking about this and making a case for or against it, and looking at some idiosyncrasies that come with gentrification and potentially talk about some benefits. And should we want to harness those benefits, what are the things that we should be putting in place? My name is Tayo Odunsi. I lead the team at Northcourt Real Estate. Northcourt is a real estate advisory, research, valuations, brokerage, and management company with offices in Lagos and Abuja in Nigeria. We also obviously do transactions across West Africa, in Ghana, and in Abidjan. I have two fantastic panelists, and I would allow them to introduce themselves. I have Temitope Roshenwe and Papa Omotayo. I'll just call on Tope to introduce himself and his organization.
Thank you very much, Tayo. My name is Temitope Roshenwe, the Managing Director of Dutum Company Limited. Dutum is an integrated service provider in the infrastructure, housing, and building construction space. We operate out of Nigeria, and we have some transactions in Accra and in Senegal as well. We're, in the forefront of pushing on affordable housing provision in Nigeria, as well as redefining the building construction skyline in Nigeria and in Africa. It's a pleasure to be on this platform and on this panel session. Thank you. Brilliant.
Thank you so much. Papa.
Hi, good morning. Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Tayo, Temitope, great to meet you. My name is Papa Omotayo. I'm the CEO and Creative Director of MOE Plus Art Architecture, an architectural and design practice based in Lagos, Nigeria, working across sectors. Our primary focus is in civil architecture. We do a lot of work within the arts, and we do some residential and commercial architecture. Our focus is really about finding ways to have a more environmentally responsive architecture that is more contextual to our environment, our culture, and how we live. I mean, we operate most of our work is in Lagos, and some of it extends to other states within Nigeria. Again, our focus is really looking at locality and how that can produce architecture that is relevant to the African condition.
Brilliant. Great. Fantastic panel I have here today. I have a builder and an architect environmentalist, and we're here to talk about gentrification. So hopefully we won't have a brawl today. But it's great to have you both here, and we'll just get off to it. I mean, gentrification is oftentimes seen as a necessity, all right? Uses of localities often change, oftentimes perhaps based on a shift in income levels, a shift in demand, a shift in the way people essentially want to use space. So gentrification almost occurs naturally, but obviously we know that it also occurs, through certain influences, of what we can call big money bags. But I'll start off with you, Tope. Gentrification, is it a good, bad, or in between type of necessity? And whatever your answer is to this question, I'll say, why do you think so?
Right. Thank you, Tayo. I think the answer to the question will depend on how we define gentrification, right? Like you said, it's a highly contested issue. But I would say there is good gentrification and there is bad gentrification, right? So that means my answer is that gentrification can be good and it can be bad. Bad gentrification, is when you displace low-income families and create slums. While good gentrification, basically, you incorporate the existing community into the direction and the new focus that the community is going into. All across the world, you see examples of good and bad gentrification. So my view is that gentrification can be good and it can be bad. It all depends on how the communities are incorporated, especially the dwellers. If you even look at our federal capital city, you can almost call it some form of gentrification because, the original dwellers, still exist in pockets around the city. But the federal capital is a good city. Whether they were able to incorporate everyone or not is another question that we'll be answering in the course of this panel session. So I think gentrification is good when it is well planned with the communities that exist there fully incorporated into the new community that is created.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tokwe. You were able to stand in between very well. Well, let's hear from Papa. What do you think? Good, bad, in between? Why do you think so?
I think gentrification is problematic. You can't talk about gentrification without talking about why it exists, right? Gentrification is about capitalism, yeah? And it's about a structure of capital and how do you constantly create capital. And it's a new term, I think the misconception that communities haven't been evolving throughout time, throughout history, I don't think that's the case. I think when people say gentrification is, cities evolving, environments evolving, no, it's not. It's about how capital is changing how communities evolve or how cities develop. My problem with it is that it's such a one-tone perspective, right? So let me give you an example. It's like everywhere you go now that is so-called gentrified looks the same, no matter where you are in the world. Like there's coffee shops on the corner, or there's some nice condos, but the language is the same. And that language is not a language that's come about from the locality. It's a language that comes about from capitalism. Like it's about capital. Let's not call it anything else. So when we're talking about, getting rid of slums or people that live on the lagoon, we're talking about the need to generate capital and the need to transform something that's existing to make it have capital. So for me, like, I don't even know what that term gentrification is. I can't associate anything with it because for me, it's like, it's everything that is bad with the world, and I don't think there's any good in it. But let me understand, like, but I'm a realist, right? It's a reality of our times. Like, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it's not a reality. It's a reality, but I don't think there's any way you can coat it. It's a bad thing. It destroys communities fundamentally because it makes people turn what was something important into capital. I mean, a perfect example is like this idea of property asset growth, right? And I was laughing the other day when I was talking to somebody about how, like, in Nigeria, somebody was telling me how they were so excited. They bought a property, and they bought a property 3 years ago for like, 80 million naira, right? And somebody pointed out, you know what? If you had just taken that 80 million naira, changed it to pounds, held it in your bank account, today you'd have bought 2 instead of 1, right? because the idea that value that he associated with his property now has half the value. So all of these things for me are when we think about how we develop the city. It's the same issue. It's the same reason why I have problems with places like Echo Atlantic, right? But I do think, investment is needed. Let's not get me wrong. I do think like important areas like Surulere, Lagos Island, Festac, Ikorodu, they need capital in order for them to be, to reach their potential and to offer and to offer positive environments for the people that either work or live there. And I think that is a baseline before we even get to gentrification. So I think in Nigeria, we just even need to establish a baseline of a livable, workable city before we can even start thinking about how that now translates into capital assets that can now form structures for gentrification. Because, like you said, right in the Wild West, you can talk about the Lekki axis and how much it's transformed over the last 20 years. And there's a principle of gentrification that you could apply to it, but I don't think that is even what happened there. That was just empty land, right? That its function changed because of population growth, because of the reality of Nigeria, of the people that were coming into Lagos needed to be addressed. It wasn't necessarily about 100% only about this idea of capital. So maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay, thank you so much, Papa. Very interesting perspectives, and I won't say I'm exactly surprised because I know I have some clue as to where your leanings are. But I'm going to ask my second question. I'm eager to hear your thoughts on my second question, but I'll start off with Tokwe on this as well. And it's essentially, just off the back of what Papa said, and just kind of like a rebuttal saying, but isn't gentrification potentially a tool for modernization of African cities? And I mean, this is a West African conference. Let's talk about West African cities. Isn't gentrification a tool of if not just even emergence of cities, the emergence of high streets, all right? And take, for example, I forgot what this road is called in Osu. These were all block of apartments, back in the day in Osu. But that's one of the biggest high streets in Ghana, in Accra, Ghana, right now. And we all know of Ademola Adetokobo in Abuja. We all know of Olobasanjo Way in Port Harcourt. We all know of Fola Oshibo in Lekki Phase 1. They've essentially been gentrified from homes, apartments, into high streets. And in some context, none comes to mind of the emergence of much more modern cities. So isn't gentrification a veritable tool, for this kind of emergence, because just to layer on and to get your answer straight, I can remember just even 10, 15 years ago, I would have had complaints of, where to, have coffee with a friend, just to sit down, the way you can do in other parts of the world, or where you could just do, just co-work or, stuff. But on these high streets that now exist, these services, now exist, and, essentially modernizing African, West African cities and West African towns. So what do you have to say to that, Tokwe?
Thank you, Tayo. And going on the back of what Papa ended his submission with, this is about movement of capital, and there can be major development of towns, localities, and cities without capital coming in. So essentially, in response to your question, Tayo, I feel that it is almost inevitable for cities to improve without gentrification. It's not possible for improvements to happen in cities without gentrification. Modernization, rural-urban migration, and just generally developing the areas in the cities and in the towns that we have require capital. And when capital is moving, capital requires return. So capital will always move in the direction of the highest return. And in the absence of, infinite pot of capital, we need to put the capital to best use in a manner that gives the best return to the owner of the capital. And that could be government and it could be private individuals. So essentially, what I'm saying to what you're saying, Taya, is that this gentrification is essential for development of our cities and just in general for development. Like you said, you spoke about co-working spaces. Now you can see what is going on in Yaba. Yaba becoming people referring to it as Silicon Valley of Africa and all of that. All of that is going to definitely come with some form of urbanization or gentrification, if you want to call it. And if the world is becoming global, it means that our cities must be livable by global citizens, right? And there are certain qualities that global cities have. So if you want your city or your towns to become global in nature, then you must be able to present what is global for your potential guests. So I would say it is essential for capital to flow to develop cities. All that needs to happen is that needs to be properly planned, and people like Papa needs to be consulted early when those type of plans are being made, so that a lot of things are incorporated and the cities are developed in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way. But gentrification, for the purpose of development of African cities, we cannot do without it.
Thank you so much, Tokwe. Thank you so much. So your thoughts, Papa, gentrification a tool for modernization of West African cities?
Look, Temi Tokwe is on. I can't even argue with him because he's a right honorable. Let me just say that he's very clear. He understands that it's a very complex issue. So I'm not even going to try and make this thing pretend like it's a black and white issue. But when you use the word tool, I don't think gentrification is a tool for African cities, because it's proved that it doesn't work in cities across the world. Yeah, because if it did work, we wouldn't see the constant backlash, whether you're in America, in Europe, in South America, or everywhere that it's been used as a tool where you're having a neighborhood transitioning so quickly in terms of its value that it's displacing the people that were there originally. I mean, think about the West Indian immigrant communities in places like West London, whether that's Notting Hill, Ladbroke Grove, all of these areas where, these are very sought after areas now by predominantly rich Western Europeans, yeah? And those communities become completely dissipated, right? And it's not to say that this process is not inevitable. Tokwe said it, look, this thing is about capital. We're on a forum here that is about how do you invest in West Africa, and investing in West Africa is important. I believe in that. I believe in terms of the importance of communities to have homes and people to have homes.
It seems Papa's dropped off.
Yeah.
Okay, Papa, can you continue your comments now, please?
Yeah, what I was saying is that I think if we're talking about tools, we need to create new tools. And I don't think the model of gentrification is a tool that is applicable to the West African geographical zone for a number of reasons. Fundamentally, it doesn't speak to the complexity of the space in terms of the various dynamics, whether that's cultural, whether that's infrastructural issues, whether that's geopolitical issues, because I think it only speaks to the idea of like value and return. And I think within our spaces, we need to think about more complex problems which we need to speak to. But I also think fundamentally, like we're just even at the space where the focus has to be, for me, is like creating even an initial level playing field. It's providing access to a uniform level of infrastructure, a uniform level of expectations. You know, whether that's in whether that is in, like Temitope is doing, housing, whether that's in leisure, whether that's in commerce, and I think that has to be the founding state that we're in. If from that basis, like new model of how those communities now transform to become new communities, I think that's a very different conversation. But I find it problematic to use this kind of boom, this boom principle of gentrification and applying it to the West African property development market. And because if you look at it realistically, it doesn't seem to be working, right? Because we're an import economy. We still need to focus on an export economy. And now that export economy can now, you know, create real consumers. There's huge amount of empty high-end real estate properties. But, you know, if Temitope, for instance, is focusing on a demographic that is probably most in need. And I think when we're thinking about that demographic and what that demographic needs, and I think how they now want to transition from starting off as like mid to low income, and then how they themselves over a number of years want to now change their communities into something else. I think that is a conversation for a later time. And I hope that the tools we create are something that is more participatory, like Temitope himself mentioned at the start of this conversation. I hope I wasn't talking to myself. Tyler,
Tyler, are you there? Oh, wow.
Anyway,
Papa, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Maybe we can just continue the conversation. Like, it'll be good to hear your thoughts in terms of how, you know, the work that you're doing, especially in developing mass housing, like how is that affecting the areas that you're focusing on in terms of the locations and the zones?
Hello, Papa, can you hear me?
Well, it looks like Taya is trying to jump in. Taya, is your connection just a bit delayed?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, but it seems like you have a lag.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let me just get one question in for Papa, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I had a question for Temitope, okay, but you can get a question in for me.
Okay. I'll let you ask your question right after this. So, Papa, what I hear you say, and let me just ask this, is, in your opinion, do you think gentrification is in part a private sector response to West African government's inability to plan urban centers adequately? Yeah.
I don't think gentrification has anything to do with where the continent, whether it's Africa. I think what the private sector is being forced to do is to realize the opportunities that the government are unable to realize, and are able to deliver it in a way that speaks to the consumers. I think the private sector is just using common sense. I don't think it's anything to do with gentrification. I think there's a massive inability by the governments. I can't speak for the whole of West Africa. I can just speak for my own country. There's a lack of understanding of global first practices. There's a lack of knowledge about the aspirations of, massive amounts of people in Nigeria. And I think the private sector, because the private sector, is fundamentally based on this idea that, like, look, what's going on? How do we generate value from it? And how do we create products that people want? I mean, that's what the private sector's focus is. And if there is an opportunity where they're not, there's an opportunity for them to do these things, they're going to do these things. So I just think the private sector is just responding to the opportunities that the government are unable to do. That's really, I don't think gentrification has anything to do with it. I don't think it's at all a gentrification. I think it's about opportunity.
Okay, great. Yeah, please go ahead, ask your question to Tokwe.
No, Tokwe, as I was saying earlier, I'm really interested to see how, you especially working in mass housing, which we know is one of the biggest issues of Nigeria at the moment. The deficit is massive. How have you found, like, the places that you're working, and how what you're doing has transformed those places?
Thank you for that question, Papa. So you see, if we start back from where the source of all of this is, it's about capital, right? Which means that we as developers look for opportunities, right? However, as a mass housing developer providing affordable housing, it's almost impossible for me to get location in Ikoyi or Lekki or Victoria Island. The place where we can develop mass housing that will be affordable most of the time is usually at the outskirts of the cities. So in reality, a lot of the things that we do actually brings development to the outskirts, because in our plans for development now, we incorporate the total living so that people can live, work, and play in the environment, so they don't necessarily need to go far away. So our communities, we generally have schools, churches, mosques, play centers, police stations, parks for kids to play in, just trying to develop a holistic city. So what you find is that we don't find land in the middle of the city because, of course, we're in a capitalist world. It'll be too expensive to build anything mass housing in the middle of the city. And the part that government needs to play in the ability to have affordable housing, one of the key things government does now in Nigeria is that they give land to the developers. So by the time you take out the cost of land, you are able to deliver the houses to the end users at an affordable price. And of course, if I was to speak with the governor of Lagos State, for example, and say, Mr. Governor, I want to develop mass housing, he's not going to find me land in Ikoyi, Ikeja, GRA, or any of those existing places. He's going to find me land maybe in Ekpe or Ikorodu, or he might even say, look, let me speak to my colleague in Ogun State and find you land in Mowe or any of those places. So we find that in a lot of the things that and the same thing is in Abuja. When we try to do mass housing projects in Abuja, we are constantly pushed to the outskirts. So you find people building mass housing in Guagalada, if you're familiar with Abuja. They're building in Buari, moving towards Kubwa. Some people going almost as far as Suleja, because it is about where you can get affordable land, so that the houses can be affordable. So it's quite an interesting question, you see, because in reality, what a lot of the things that we're doing now then does is that we're actually taking development to those rural areas, as opposed to them needing to come to the city centers. The development is now going over there. And of course, it changes a lot of things. Right from the moment construction starts, the entire environment changes. When you're creating jobs, people are getting income, the environment begins to change. Everything just changes. And you then begin to see an improvement in the lifestyle of the locals in the areas where we're developing. So yes, everything has its advantages and disadvantages, but I've seen how mass housing and affordable housing development is actually transforming a lot of communities that we work in presently.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I'm really interested in, because I do think that, like the government push you to the outskirts, right? But a lot of those people that are living in mass housing are working within the city, right?
Absolutely.
So there's now this additional cost of them getting into the city, even though they can only live on the outskirts, right? Which now causes a value issue in terms of where they live relative to where they work and what becomes their disposable income. Yeah. So they're now unable to even participate outside of their own environment. What I mean by that is you live at 2 hours away. Yeah. It's costing you 2K every time you have to go to the island. Yeah. You now want to participate in something on the island, maybe a nice store that has some nice drinks. You can't do that yet, because that extra 500 naira that you may have been able to buy a drink has now into your transport.
Yeah.
So this idea for me is like, you're creating value, but the government also needs to understand that the value also needs to be creating clusters, so people are closer to where they work and where they live, right? And that's how you create real value. And on the back of that, it allows for, like everything that you said, it allows for new economies to be generated. And I think what I'm saying, when I was saying about what we need is a flat line, we need to create value in the first place, before we now look at how we're just making this sort of generic, gentrified spaces that people cannot participate in. Yeah? So Temitope is doing something over there, and the government is saying those people over there, they can't participate in the happenings of central Lagos, even though that's the places that they're working in. We're just going to keep going round and round and round and round and round and round.
And Papa, this essentially leads to my next question, and I'll direct that at you actually. What are your thoughts on mixed use, as some form of option, to creating better engagement and participation? All right. So these spaces are in need of gentrification, so to say, oftentimes away from residential to commercial. But what are your thoughts about mixed use? All right, instead of a full-fledged change of use to mixed use, thereby absorbing some of the residential use and the commercial together, and meeting the requirements of the capitalist, to generate decent revenue and potentially even diversifying their revenue just in case of headwinds. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, look, I'm 100% for diversification. I think anybody that is does not understand that, you need this environment. Like, let's just think about who we are as a people. We're nobody is just doing one thing, right? You have one job on the side, you are doing something else. So we understand this culture of multifaceted applications. And what the West has told us is that if you don't create spaces that are mixed use and multi adaptable, over a period of time, that single space, that single use becomes no longer relevant. Because whether that's in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, or 50 years' time, we need to build flexibility and adaptability into the development industry. And I think mixed use is an important aspect of that. But I think even extending beyond mixed use, we need to constantly create developments that allow for new models to now be plugged in, at any space in time. And that also requires, let's be honest, requires like planning policy that allows for more flexibility. I'm not talking about just residential here, but also recognizing that there is so much service industry in this environment, whether we like to use it or not. Like, whether it's your vulcanizer, your steward, and we're used to a culture where people are very easily accessible. I mean, when I speak to like my colleagues in the UK and they talk about, oh man, they had to book a plumber 3 months in advance. That is a culture that came about from a single use scenario. And I think here we have the opportunity to create very mixed scenarios, and that can be in our construction, that can be in our development. Like Temitope, when you mentioned about, you're not just doing mass housing, right? You're thinking about the schools, you're thinking about all these other things. But my question to you is that, how do you make sure that the school becomes sustainable, right? Can the school also act as an event center? And you know what I mean? When the revenue of the schools, is not able to come in, how do we build flexibility to make sure that everybody is constantly thinking outside of the box?
So you see, I was going to say, as you were talking about what you just said now, that look, every one of us just needs to become a lot more creative in what we're doing. And that goes also, apart from the schools, it is then the need for communities to have work centers, industries, maybe factories close by. So if you see what is going on in the Ibejuleki towards the Dangote refinery axis. So some actually argue that industry should drive, development, and that, naturally when there's a cluster of where people can live and work, then by default, the communities, the residential then comes on the back of the commercial, right? So in us answering your question, how do we make the school sustainable? In reality, once the school infrastructure is built, right, and there are students coming in every term, every semester, the schools can run themselves. Then you can then turn the schools into hubs. That's an interesting point of view that I haven't thought about before. You turn the schools into hubs that become like community centers when the school is not in session, and then so that the schools become sustainable and they become a hub for the entire community. That's an interesting point to note. Yeah. Is Tayo back?
Yeah, he's back. Ty, are you with us? He may be frozen.
Okay.
But and how do you find like government regulation? How has that hampered or supported your efforts in terms of transforming these places that you're working?
I think if we focus on Nigeria, right, there's a lot more seriousness that the government needs to put to this. For example, I'll tell you, we're about to start a development, mass housing, in Abeokuta, right? And government's responsibility to make that development affordable for the target audience is to provide roads, infrastructure that lead to the development. However, government claim they don't have the money for this. So we end up building these cities. First, we cannot put them in the middle of town, and then we have to take them to the outskirts, and then roads don't get there. And you see, then people don't want to live there. That you see, there's an example of another one that a good friend of mine has at the outskirts of Abuja. The roads are not great to get to the place. They are the outskirts, despite the fact that they're selling the houses for 3 million, 2.5 million naira in Nigerian naira. Yeah, 3 million. People don't want to live there because it is so.
3 million. They managed to get
3 million
down to 5 million.
Wow. 3 million, yes, 3 million for a one-bedroom bungalow in that estate, supported by some organizations. But people don't want to live there because it is so uncomfortable to get there. The roads are bad. Power infrastructure, water. You end up, as a planner and an environmentalist, you know that what we do, just sinking boreholes everywhere, the way we do, is bad for the environment. But that's what people end up doing. So government policies need to. It seems like we play a lot of lip service. So it sounds good, yeah. Let's do mass housing, PPP, all of that. But the idea of it being PPP is that everybody has a part to play. So if you want me to be able to sell it at those prices, you must fulfill your part of the bargain. So that includes, infrastructure, how much I pay for planning permits. You can't expect me to pay the same thing as those who are developing in Victoria Island and in Ikoyi. As a matter of fact, if you're really serious, you should say anyone developing mass housing and affordable housing, we waive you waive it all together because we're actually providing a social service.
I actually have an idea that I'm gonna, I've always been wondering, right? So in your scenario, because I know it's one of the most common things, when it comes to mass housing, where there's a JV with government is supposed to provide the infrastructure, and you provide the housing. And I know some people have tried to tell government that, in the rest of the world, for instance, what they do, because I don't go Nigeria, I own is not affordable housing, is because affordable housing implies that people have income, right?
That's right. That's another conversation, actually.
Right.
Yeah.
But one of the things I was wondering is that why doesn't government look at it this way? Look, you have these very high-end developments happening, yes, that you can't incorporate any sort of social housing or social quota to it, right? Why is it not possible? And since government doesn't have funding for the infrastructure for the mass housing, why do they not work out a way to get the high-end people to create the infrastructure for the mass housing? So therefore, government is sort of working on a more bartering level. Because I think, the reality is government does not have money, right? But in order for us to even talk about things like mass housing, gentrification, it requires policy, and not just on paper, like Temitope said, real actionable policy. And if the government is sort of putting its hands up and saying, look, the PPP we're always talking about is really just a story. We actually, we can't actually offer anything. But we need to figure out a way, because, look, let's be real with ourselves. We can't create all roads that will be taxed, yes,
Mm-hmm.
by toll gates. You want to, I'm sure, the road that you need to get to your development, right? It can't be told. It makes no sense, right?
No.
But there's a way that government can figure out how it can find another way to pay for it, yeah, within the same industry. I don't know how developers will feel about that, but I'm sure developers will feel more comfortable creating
Hello?
infrastructure as an offset of tax,
Uh,
yes, than just
Mm-hmm.
Tokwe
paying
and Papa?
money to government, right? So it's like you said, Tintokwa is like, look, let's look at this. If you're doing infrastructural projects that have to do with housing, or you're doing a big residential private development, a way for you to offset your tax is to create infrastructure for mass housing development, which we have highlighted that we're supposed to provide a road to. We haven't been able to. So you guys provide the road to that. And I think these kinds of partnerships is the kind of, I guess, creative thinking, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
that we all really need to think about. Otherwise, like you said, there's housing available for 5 million, 3 million in Nigeria, and people are not willing to purchase
People don't want
it.
to live in.
That to
Yeah.
me is just is worrying. Is worrying.
Right. Ty, are you back?
But Papa, yes, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Papa, you shouldn't let that worry or surprise you too much because I mean, I heard Tokwe say while he was talking, if the place is too far, is inaccessible, it just doesn't cut it just doesn't cut it, so that's just it. As we begin to round up, I just want to hear from Tim Tokwe. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about gentrification, mass housing, redevelopments, and with all of this, there are, we just get into we're skating past a number of things that are required, to even gentrify or change use and all of that. So, as a builder and a developer, what are the potential challenges, costs, and pitfalls of actually remodeling existing projects, for different uses as against building new ones?
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Tyler.
Same talk about you. Yeah, I said we've spoken a lot about gentrifying use, gentrification, and that has to do with changing use and all that. But from your own builder perspective, what are the challenges, cost, and pitfalls to remodeling existing projects for different uses as against building those such buildings afresh?
Right. Okay, thank you, Tyler. So you see, several things, I think, and this cannot be spoken about without talking about architecture, because the beginning of anything always has to do with architecture. Even if we are remodeling existing cities, there's always an architect's work that has gone before that, right? And then, but some of the things you find is that when that has been done, and then maybe some structural investigations have been done before we eventually come in, the builders, the construction companies, are usually the last set of people that show up on the field. By that time, the architects have done their work, structural engineers have done their work, the town planners have done their work. Some of the things we find is, of course, the inconvenience of having to work in a space where people presently live, right? The health and safety issues that come with that. Those are big issues that we deal with every now and then. And then one of the key ones also is the fact that sometimes you encounter surprises. You thought this building was this way, that building was this way, but when you start pulling the building apart, you discover that it wasn't what you thought was there, is exactly what you find. So I actually find, and I prefer personally, doing brand new work, that's building from scratch, a brand new location, everything is new and fresh. But of course, in the times we're in, it is inevitable that because land is finite. We're always going to need to redevelop what we have done before. There are always improvements, improvements to architecture, improvements to the environment we want to make, which means we always have to go back to some of the things we've built in the past and redevelop them, redesign them for new use. That is essentially a part of the built environment. So I personally feel that while there are challenges, remodeling existing cities and towns and localities is essential for development, because as things improve, you have to move with that development. However, as we see in many parts of the world, you have what they call protected buildings, right? Just trying to preserve the heritage of the community. There are certain buildings in different parts of Europe and in the UK that you cannot break, you cannot change the facade. So I think we need to incorporate that into our architecture and planning, where the planning that goes in needs to have some protection for the existing environment, preserve certain architecture, certain heritage that we will come back to and make reference to 100 years, 200 years. We need to protect some of those and then do the rest of our development around some of these heritage structures and developments. But I'm sure Papa will have a lot of interesting thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much, Tokwe. Papa, just kind of like as a final question, and in line with what Tokwe has said, what are your thoughts? Because yes, I know you may not be for gentrification, though. I mean, you are for it in terms of knowing that it is a reality. But what are your thoughts in an ideal world? If you could control all the developments in West African cities, what would be your recommendation for modernizing African cities? Obviously, you do not think they should stay static, you know. So what would be your thoughts for modernizing African cities as against, you know, just getting them gentrified, pulled down, knocked down, and stuff like that?
I mean, it's very complicated, and I wouldn't want to pretend like I have an answer because, you know, even the African, how much of African cities I even understand is even limited to, let me be honest, Lagos, and even a particular part of Lagos. Maybe for me, the part of Lagos I understand the best is Lagos Island. And if I use that as a reference point, I think there's, you know, it's a part, and I'm sure there are many African cities where you can see the different layers of its history, different layers of use, and different stratas of population, right? And I think when we look at African cities, it's that dynamic, interactive, multi-layered, you know, interactions that we need to ensure that is part of our planning. You know, this mixed neighborhood, both social, economical, cultural, use, and I think that should be our focus going forward. I do agree that there's some areas that, you know, need preservation, like Temitope has highlighted, whether that's for natural reasons, historical reasons. But I think because most of the African cities are still at the beginning of their development, the first stage is to just establish who we are, what we want to look like. I'm very much against the Dubai, Singapore type templates because, you know, everybody knows Singapore came to Nigeria in the 1970s, you know, to do research, and they were able to create their own model, which is now the envy of the world. I think it's important for us to look inward and create our own models. And I think that applies right across the continent. I think there's enough understanding and there's enough desire to create new models. So I think for me, it's that interwoven mix. I think we have to create multi-dynamic, integrated, multifunctional spaces. And I think that will be our winning solution.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Papa, for sharing these thoughts and for the insights that you've dropped. Tokwe, thank you for laying down all your experience and what you've seen in the development and construction space, as regards gentrification. I trust this session has been very, very useful to all our listeners. Yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good.
Thank you. Thank you.